Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. Today we are talking with Andrew Liptak. Andrew has just written a book called Cosplay, A History. So if you like fan culture and cosplay, you're going to love this book. It comes out this June. So we hope you enjoy this conversation we have with Andrew. Episodes of Tales from the Bridge are coming out every 2 weeks for the summer, so check us out every other Wednesday. There will be a new episode. All right, let's make our way over to the bridge.
We're very happy to have Andrew Liptak with us today. Andrew is a writer, a journalist, and an historian. His published works include science fiction short stories, articles on nonfiction military history, and he has a science fiction newsletter called Transfer Orbit, which aims to make sense of science fiction and how it helps us understand the future. Andrew has just published a historical nonfiction book called Cosplay, A History, which explores how dressing up in costume as fictional characters has become a mainstream cultural phenomenon. It must be noted, however, that Andrew is a bad guy. He's an official mad scientist for TRADOC, which is the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, which sounds horribly evil, and he openly aligns himself with the dark side of the Force through his affiliation with the legendary 501st Legion, which, for those who don't know, is an international organization dedicated to the dark side of Star Wars. And while he's clearly a bad guy, I think he's actually a good guy. Regardless, though, we're fine with mad scientists and the dark side. So thanks for being here, Andrew. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I feel like the mad scientist designation needs a little bit of an explanation.
Let's get one.
So what the mad scientist thing is TRADOC is the Training and Doctrine Command for the U.S. Army, and one of the things that I've been very interested. My background is in military history. I attended Norwich University, which was a military academy here in Vermont. I was there as a civilian, but I studied military history for my master's. And as I was getting into journalism and was writing about science fiction and real world stuff, the two sort of blended. So one of the things that I've written about quite a bit over the years is how fiction can be useful to the U.S. military as a training thing. So I got the designation because I was invited to a sort of a small conference that they put on. It was about. This was 2017 or thereabouts. It was basically like a seminar designed to sort of imagine how would the U.S. military train in like 20, 30 years from now, so like 2050 and beyond. And so I was invited to talk about story and narrative and just like how fiction can be used as a training tool. So like you can sort of if you can imagine something, you could write it down, and you don't have to necessarily spend a lot of money to hire a writer to do those sorts of things or create scenarios. So what the military does, at least to a small extent, is to write short science fiction stories or commission short science fiction stories to get people to think about the future of warfare. And that's sort of how I got that as I attended that conference. And I've done a couple of other ones over the years. One was trying to develop a training exercise, developing a simulation for trying to imagine yourself going up against an adversary with an artificial intelligence system. So rather than build an entire artificial intelligence system, get a whole bunch of people to the right area, and then have them like mock fight, you can just imagine it on a tabletop. So that's sort of one of my interests, and the things that I've written about over the years is the sort of the useful nature of fiction.
Very cool.
A little bit long-winded, so forgive me.
Great. Cool. We actually talked to another guy, Carl Schrader. I don't know if you him. He's a science fiction author. Yes,
I'm very familiar with his work. He's one of the. So a couple of years ago, for a site called 10, which was Medium's tech vertical, I wrote a feature article about this sort of what one author calls FIC-int, fictional intelligence.
Right.
And a bunch of years ago, I actually came across Carl's work, and I've met him a couple times, and his work is a really early example of this, and it's a really neat. He wrote a really great story. I'm blanking on the name right now. It's a Crisis in Aurelia, I think. I think you can, if you search for it, you can find it online. Yeah. It's a neat little short fiction, sort of like novella-length story where about a group of Canadian peacekeepers go into this unnamed or this fictional African African country to, and they come up across people armed with cell phones and drones, and that's pretty commonplace now. But this was written in like 2003, so it's neat to see sort of this brand of science fiction that is actually really doing some neat predictive stuff. It's not really like 100% accurate, but at least the idea behind this is it gets you thinking about how the future might play out, and then if you can sort of imagine a future, you can sort of work your way back and think of like what are the little building blocks that you'd have to hit along the way. So
yeah,
and my interview with Carl was really influential for me because he was talking about, he said that his upbringing, he grew up in sort of a religious community. He was very much a pacifist, and he saw this as a way to, not as a way to sort of support war, but a way to get people to think a little bit better about how they wage it. And so, the article, there's a sort of a fine line between like trying to write about the military and trying to seem like you're all out advocating for what they do versus, how do you sort of approach warfare and conflict in a very smart way, with the idea that if you approach it and you train people right, you won't have to use military force as much. At least that's the theory. That's how I hope my contributions have helped, is if, maybe there's somebody who's thought about, it gets people to think a little bit more about like, if you're an officer or a commander, how do you commit your forces? How do you commit the people under your command, and maybe do so in a way that's not like wasteful or I guess terrible. So
strategic foresight is what Carl says.
Yes,
and just to stay on the with Carl here is interesting little tidbit here. Talking with you, Andrew, is we met with Carl at Fan Expo Toronto. And did a panel with Carl, so we got to hang out with him, and we invited him to do a panel.
Oh, great!
Which he did on colonizing Venus. So it was really fun to see him, and obviously hang out with Carl Schrader, surrounded by people in cosplay, was a neat little thing.
Yeah, and he's a really nice guy. As I said, I've met him once or twice at cons, and I've really enjoyed talking to him. It's been a couple years since I met him, but it was a good chat, and I learned a lot from him, and it's something I haven't written a lot of science fiction in that vein, but it's definitely something that has sort of gotten me, it sort of influenced me, like, because as I go to write a story, I'm trying to think of like, what are some of the core lessons that I want to convey to the reader, not necessarily to try to predict what technology might exist, but like the idea behind that technology is, what can we learn from it by looking at the technology that we have today, and trying to think about how we can thoughtfully put it into use. Again, with the idea that if we can make good decisions, we can avoid conflict down the road. And I think that if you train commanders to think about it the right way, you're not going to make either stupid mistakes or strategic mistakes. And maybe people, I don't think it'll happen, but maybe people will not fight or find diplomatic ways to go about things. So,
well, you can certainly
and it's also a good way to think about
the process of warfare, right? Like I think what you're saying, right, is like you can make it better, as in ameliorate warfare, right? Like rather than just do what people do.
Yeah, and I mean, the story of war is also a story of technology, and every time we go through some sort of technological advance, there's a learning curve. Right now we're seeing some pretty horrific things in Ukraine, and we've seen precursors to that around the world, places in Syria or even in Ukraine back in 2014, when it comes to like social media or how technology, if you attack technology infrastructure in the right way, it can be a weakness. So it's interesting to see sort of how that plays out.
And what does that? Because you have a background in military history. That's kind of unique. I don't know that there are too many science fiction authors who have a background in military history. How does that kind of inform your writing and what you do?
A couple of interesting ways. I mean, it's an interesting field, I think that there are a lot of science fiction writers throughout science fiction, the history of science fiction writers that have been deeply interested in how, military affairs, the military history works. Look at like Robert Heinlein or Joe Haldeman. Like, some of these folks have actual military backgrounds that informs their work. I don't have the military background, but I sort of look at it as a history thing, or more as a historical thing, and it is worth keeping in mind that history, like there's a saying that, like, people who forget history are doomed to repeat it. I don't think that's entirely correct. I much more prefer what I think it was Mark Twain that said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think ultimately history is a study of human nature and how do people make decisions and do things. And is the better you can understand the people that you are studying, the better idea you'll get of how they might react to something else. So it's kind of funny. I work for the Vermont Historical Society here in Vermont, and I just came across a picture taken almost exactly 100 years ago, 101 years ago, of soldiers here in Vermont marching off the war. And, I imagine that process was very much the same. Like, the people who were getting on the train with their uniforms and their guns and their backpacks were thinking a lot. They were thinking the same things that they were thinking, the guys and women who go to war now. Like, they're wondering if they'll see their families again. They're hoping that they won't mess up. They're hoping they won't die. They're hoping that they'll, do right by their fellow soldiers. So I think that there's a lot that you can sort of learn from the past that you can then apply to the future. That's how I've tried to do it. I wouldn't say I'm really all that successful at writing science fiction. I've published a couple of short stories on my own, and I've got one professionally published. It's something that I continually practice at. Let's put it that way.
Having a master's in military history, I think, because we were talking to
John Scalzi?
Old Man's War. John Scalzi.
Yeah.
And there's a man who also incorporates a lot of war content into his writing, and he does a great job. But I feel like the realism, and these days too, especially with the Ukraine, a lot of this stuff is top of mind for a lot of different people. Mm-hmm. So, but to tell us a bit more about cosplay now, on a lighter note, what here's the book that you've just published. We've seen a lot of this, people dressing up, and can you tell us what is cosplay?
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. Like, you've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
So the definition that I have, I don't know if I don't like. First of all, I don't like definitions because there's so many sort of edge cases and exceptions to any rule that you put out. But the way I approached cosplay as my definition was, it was basically somebody dressing up to relate to a story, whether or not that was real or fictional. I see it as a very broad umbrella activity. Like the cosplay, as I largely talk about and as everybody sort of acknowledges, is basically a pop culture phenomenon. So if you are dressing up as a fan to put yourself in the Star Wars universe as a stormtrooper, like I do, that's one way to do it. Or if you're building stuff to, or trying to replicate costumes that you see, that's all sort of on the cosplay that you'll most popularly see. I don't know how controversial it will be to sort of lump in other groups alongside it, like reenactors or LARPers, but I sort of see them, if it's not cosplay, they're cousins. It's sort of a because, like, if you're a Civil War reenactor, you're trying to get closer to the story of the American Civil War, or the story of World War II, or the Napoleonic era, or the American Revolutionary War. So that's basically how I approached it, and not just necessarily reenacting, but like folks who build like replica spacesuits, or they want something like that for themselves. I think that we are storytelling creatures, and we like to sort of, throughout history, we've sort of added props to our repertoire when we are recounting stories to one another. And cosplay, I think, is another version of that practice of storytelling. We're not necessarily telling our own story. We're trying to sort of dabble in an existing story, but we're trying to sort of imagine ourselves in that world, or at least bringing it to life for the folks around us. So if I'm dressing up as a stormtrooper with a 501st, I'm trying to it depends on the event. If I'm at a convention, I'm trying to bring it to life for my fellow fans who are, they have a very in-depth knowledge. So, that's where you tend to see people dressing up as more niche characters or really obscure things. If I'm doing like a Make-A-Wish event with the 501st, I'll dress up as a stormtrooper because that's really recognizable. Or if I'm at a parade, I might go with something that's super recognizable, like an Imperial stormtrooper. So with the idea that some kid might see it, or a parent might see it and think, oh, Star Wars, and they can come and take a picture with me, or they can see me from the sidelines, or give me a high five. And then for that brief moment, that world comes alive for them, and that's a very cool thing. So,
and tell me about the 501st Legion. What's that all about?
We're just a bunch of dorks in plastic.
Have you guys come up to? Well, I know 501st comes to Toronto. Have you come to Toronto, Andrew?
I have been to Toronto, not as a trooper, not
as a trooper. Okay.
As a journalist, I've been to Toronto a couple times. I went and visited the set for The Expanse when it was shooting up there, and the sets for the sci-fi shows Dark Matter and Killjoys. That sort of my prior life as an entertainment journalist. Those were parts of junkets just to meet the cast, to interview them, and sort of get a sense of what the shooting stages looked like. Whether it's Fan Expo, or it used to be known as Boston Comic Con, or any number of other names, but like a lot of these shows sort of blend together after a little while, because they're all ultimately they're sort of the same thing. Like they're a big organization that comes into a conference center. You have the vendors room. You see a lot of the same people, so it's just kind of fun just to sort of go halfway across the country, or across the country, to sort of end up in another con that sort of looks similar to what you might have back at home, although at different scales. Boston Fan Expo is very different from San Diego Comic Con, and they all have their little quirks here and there. But it's like being part of a big family in some ways, because like you might have friends who show up for one con, or folks who show up for another con, but they're all sort of part of your nerd tribe. And that's one of the things I really like about going out to cons, is especially the big ones, is you get to see those friends you might have interacted with online, or you might have seen last time who were back.
But do you, like, you talk about being dorks in plastic? Where do you get the suits? Like, how do you get them? Do you make them?
Yeah, so it used to be that you would have to know a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a forum. And this is one of the things I talk about in the book, is that there is a long history of stormtrooper. Like, so if we want to talk about stormtrooper armor, back when Star Wars first came out, what you'd have to do is you would have to go to the movies a couple dozen times and take notes and sort of say, all right, this is what this piece of the costume looked like, and either draw it on a notebook or just try to commit it to memory. And then you go home and you try to make it out of cardboard or whatever building materials you had on hand. And I actually interviewed a guy who did this, and he made this really fantastic stormtrooper, Darth Vader, Boba Fett, and just by going time and time again to the movie theater. His name is David Ray. Unfortunately, he died after not too long after I spoke with him. He had cancer. But he shared with, or his family shared with me some really great pictures after I'd interviewed him, and there's these. I wouldn't call them like screen accurate, but they were just for the time they looked really great. So that was one way that people made stuff, is that they would fashion it out of whatever material they had on hand. And at some point, folks realized, hey, I know how they made this for the movie. I can go make this for myself, which is the process for the films was called vacuum forming. You heat up a sheet of plastic, and then you suck it down over a mold that has a vacuum cleaner underneath, and it sucks the plastic's malleable. It'll suck it down over the mold, and you get that piece of plastic in the right shape. So there was actually, I think it might have been a Toronto guy, Marco. I think he set up a website called Marco Entertainment, and basically molded his own suit of Stormtrooper armor and started selling it. Lucasfilm wasn't a fan of that. They shut him down after a little while, and basically it sort of, this sort of thing was underground for a very long time, and it still is to some extent. People can be very worried. Throughout the 1990s, folks are really worried about litigation from the big studios, because the studios thought that they're going out to make a buck on our intellectual property, and that's changed over time. And as they've sort of understood, the studios sort of understand what cosplay is, and they've sort of, as long as folks aren't really, setting up their own company and making a huge profit off of it without paying licensing fees and whatnot, they're sort of okay with it. So for a long time, to get Stormtrooper armor, you'd have folks who would just sort of make it on the side. They'd sell a kit at cost, so whatever your time and how much you spent on plastic and your vacuum forming machine, they wouldn't really bother you. So there was this network of folks who would sell this stuff. If you knew the right folks, you could get in touch with them, and send them a couple $100, and they would send you a box of plastic, and that you'd assemble. That's how Albin Johnson got his armor in the mid. I think I would say 1996, 1997, because the Star Wars films had come back to theaters. He and a friend built their 2 suits of Stormtrooper armor and went to the theater in armor and blew everybody away. And Albin sort of realized, hey, if we have more troopers, this is much cooler. So that's when he sort of set up the 501st. He started to set up the 501st, and he went to Dragon Con and did a whole bunch of events in the area, and was like, come join me. We want to make this a group. He set up a website, and people started sending in pictures of themselves, and they sort of imagined themselves as hey, I'm TK. I think I'm TK 123. This is my story, and they did that for a little while, and it just grew and grew. It became a worldwide thing after a couple of years, and it hasn't really let down ever since. I got started in 2003. I was just out of high school. I was in band in high school. I bugged my music teacher for years to let us play Star Wars, and for my final concert, we ended up playing Star Wars. And to make the concert even cooler, we ended up inviting a member of the 501st to come out and show up and show up at a pivotal moment when we started playing Imperial March. He marched down the aisle, and the crowd went nuts. And he, at the end of the night, he gave me his, I had his contact information. He said, here's how to get the armor. So I went and got it, and I got my first set of armor. So that's sort of the old way. You sort of had to know where to get it. You sort of had to know where to go. And for a long time, that's basically what it was. You could join the 501st, and they would say, in our forums, you would talk. You'd have somebody you could talk to, or they'd have it listed these folks are good to buy armor from, or skip eBay because you might get something that's overpriced or that's a scam. And so that's how a lot of these transactions happen, is through people talking to one another on internet forums. And it wasn't just the 501st. There was the Replica Props Forum. There's various detachment forums for each one of the costume types that we have in the 501st. And that's basically how that worked. It's begun to change quite a bit in the last couple of years, because what's happened is that 3D printing has really sort of democratized that a lot. because what you can do now is you can put up an entire set of armor on Thingiverse, or you can sell your plans for somebody for whatever costume you've designed, and then you don't have to actually manufacture the armor yourself. You can leave that to the user to do that. So there are entire costume types that now people, instead of going through that traditional method of vacuum forming it, they can just 3D print it. So one of the ones that I have is a Shore Trooper, which is vacuum formed, but you can buy or you can download plans to print it out yourself. And I actually have a couple of 3D printed parts on mine because of the original sculpt that I had wasn't terribly accurate. So that actually was a positive. I didn't have to replace an entire piece. I could just replace a small piece of it. And it was a little bit more accurate.
The Shore Trooper. From Rogue One?
Yes. That's the.
Okay.
Those are the guy. They're tan. They look a little bit like a scout trooper. Actually, I have a helmet right here. I can show you. These guys.
Oh yeah, totally.
They're sort of like the stormtrooper version of the Marines, I guess. And yeah, like there was a guy who designed the files and put them up on a folder for free. Said, if you want to do it, go ahead and download them, make your own, remix it, whatever. And then we've got a lot of them now. So that's one of the newer ways to do it. There's also platforms like Etsy. You can commission stuff from people, or you can buy parts. There's an entire ecosystem of web, storefronts that you can buy stuff from, or you can set up your own storefront if you're a maker. So that's all infrastructure that didn't exist when I started. I marveled at the fact that, like, when my son wanted to dress up as Spider-Man, I could just go up on Amazon and buy a Spider-Man costume that was looked pretty good, and it just arrived at my doorstep from somewhere after a couple days. And again, that was just a network that really didn't exist for me 20 years ago. So a lot's changed.
Yeah, I remember when we were at Fan Expo, they were having workshops in different types of cosplay costume creation, and this idea of 3D printing and the technology. I mean, it feels like it's more accessible. I imagine there's YouTube tutorials and this sort of thing. Like, what do you think it goes next? In terms of 3D printing and that sort of thing. Like, what's your sort of dream for 10 years from now in terms of costume creation? Because it's already pretty wild, right?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any big technological changes around the corner like 3D printing. That's a pretty advanced technology, and one of the reasons we're seeing so much of that now is because we a whole bunch of patents on the technology expired. So back in the 3D printing itself came about in the 1980s, and it was used for a lot of industrial purposes, mostly for rapid prototyping. If you're a company that needed to make something, you didn't want to spend a lot of money to make a mold of like a die cast mold or something that's really super expensive. And so the way the patents work is just they expire after a little while. They give somebody a monopoly on an idea, they can profit off of it, and then after I don't know what it is, 20, 30, 40 years, that expires, and the general public can then take advantage of it. So one of the things we've seen is that there's a lot of companies out there that have made their own 3D print. They've made their own and released their own 3D printers. And like, I've got one down in my basement. It was a couple $100, which is within the right range of a hobbyist with a little bit of disposable income. And the more you remove those barriers, the more they're going to be adopted. So as the price on 3D printing came down, the more people are going to say, like, hey, I might not spend $1,000 on this, but maybe $500 or $250 or $100. Depends on how low that barrier goes. And once you start at the low end and you start to get more proficient in it, that's when you start to spend more and more money, because you either buy more printers or more expensive equipment. My guess is that what we'll see with 3D printing is that we'll see a lot of successive advances within the technology itself. We've also seen a growth in resin 3D printers. So there's a couple different types. There's one that's extruded plastic, which is basically you have a spool of plastic wire that is put down through a nozzle, heated up, and it goes along on a computer circuit, a path that the computer dictates. So, and you adds a line of melted plastic little by little, and that's how you get your object. What a resin 3D printer does is it shoots a laser through a vat of resin, and where the lasers intersect, they will begin to form that plastic. It'll begin to cure that plastic in the vat. So once it's done, you pull it out, and you have this object without print lines or anything like that. So I think we'll see more of that. My guess is that we will see the type of extrusion printers will get a little bit better. We might see better resin printers. That's my guess, is that, just be little advances as people or as companies, develop the technology and just make it better and better. Basically that's on the manufacturing side. On the software side, I think that's probably where you'll see some other advances. I tried to model a handle for my refrigerator. We had one that broke, and I didn't want to spend the $30 or $40 to get it replaced from the company. So I tried. It's like, I can do this. It's just a simple shape. It's the flat thing with a curve, and it took me like 4 hours to try to figure out the software to try to get it, to try to make it. Your mileage will vary depending on how computer savvy you are. I did not find it very user friendly. I think that a lot of the design software is kind of esoteric and made for a certain audience. My guess is that there will be new programs that will come out that will make it much, much easier to build stuff and design stuff, for somebody who's just a casual user. That's not to say that, folks don't dive right into it and really learn how to use Blender or any of the other types of any of the other software platforms that are out there. But my guess is that, eventually, we'll see that user accessibility will be much better moving forward, or start to move forward.
You talk about democratizing cosplay with 3D printers. Maybe that's those people who are able to do the CAD drawings, and then they share it, like you said, up to Thingiverse. As they become much more accessible. Maybe that's what's really going to grow it, right? Is the people sharing and doing the hard work, making it easier for everyone else.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing right now. Actually, is this explosion in talent of people who just learn how to do this. And yeah, you'll see people who will share stuff. If I need a really simple model for something, I can grab it from there. Or if I wanted something that was a lot more accurate, I'll buy it from somebody who's selling their plans. And there's a lot of there's folks who will sell that on Etsy, or if they'll go to a Facebook page and say, like, hey, I've got these plans. I'll sell them to you for whatever it is. And we're seeing a lot of that right now, which is pretty cool. And along the same lines of the sort of the democratization thing, is that that's not limited to 3D printing. If you go onto YouTube and you type in, how do I build XYZ costume, you will probably find a whole bunch of tutorials for how to build something like that. So YouTube, this is stuff that you would used to have in forums, which was great because, like, before the internet, you'd have to do it yourself. When you have internet forums like the 501st forums or the Replica Props forum or anime.com, LiveJournal, anything like that, you would have a whole bunch. You'd have people who would have the expertise, but it was all sort of locked up in those communities that you had to go to. Now you can just easily access it by going to these platforms like YouTube, or I'm trying to think. There's a website for like how to build stuff, instructional.com, instructables.com. There's no shortage of places that will have directions for how to do stuff like that, widely available to you. And that's great. I mean, that means that it's easier for people to sort of say, like, hey, I want to dress up as this character. That barrier has been removed, or at least lowered a little bit, so that you can say, like, all right, well, I want to make a giant Lego figure, for example. I can go onto a 3D print site and find a model for a large oversized Lego I can go onto YouTube and find directions on how to make the rest of it out of cardboard, and voila, I have a large costume that I can then put together myself.
It's interesting. It's like in the early days of the internet, we had to relearn, or we learned that, like, wow, now we can have a picture of anything from everywhere, right? There was a time when it was hard to get a picture of something. You'd go to the library, you would look in books, you'd order posters, but like now all images are just available and everybody knows that, right? And there will come a time in 3D printing, right, when it'll just be so common that it'll be understood that any object is available. And I think the revolution in 10 years will be not necessarily in any part of the technology, which seems like it's developing fine, but the commonality, or just how popular it is, that it's suddenly huge changes can happen because everybody will just do it and it'll be obvious. It's kind of like Zoom, right? Like COVID put us through this time when we had the technology forever to do all this stuff, right? Have virtual meetings, and it has huge consequences of like cutting down on massive amounts of commuting and air travel and like carbon dioxide output. Like, it was huge, the benefits of just people doing Zoom meetings now, or video calls, or whatever you want to call them. Because everybody's just doing it. Now we get it. Like, oh, I don't have to go. I don't have to drive there at all. I'll just call the guy in a video. So I think the similar thing will happen with 3D printing, right? It'll just suddenly, when everybody's doing it, there will be new possibilities.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think that part of the battle is just making people realize, like, oh, this is a thing I can do.
Right.
I know that, like, when you come out of a film, like, oh, I really wish I could be Batman. You don't really think, I mean, unless you're sort of already sort of inclined to think that way, but like if you're sort of a casual fan or just a casual moviegoer, you're like, you might not take that next step, like, oh, I want to be Batman, and just sort of move on with your life. But then, or think like, maybe that'd be a good Halloween costume. But then, like, if you sort of see somebody on your Facebook page who is cosplaying as Batman, like, oh, that person's doing that, I can do that. And so I think that there's sort of this normalization that happens and that's been sped a lot, and this is one of the things I talk about in the book, is how important social media is for this, because something like a Facebook page, like a Facebook news feed, it doesn't, you're if you think about your life, you sort of separate people into buckets. So like, I have my coworkers, I have my 501st friends, I have my family, I have my school friends, and just other people in my social orbit. They're all sort of, there's some crossover between them, but they're all largely separate. What Facebook did when it released its news feed is it basically put everybody into one bucket. And so if I go to a convention, as I would do, or go to an event over the weekends, and I could get tagged in pictures or post up pictures myself, everybody would see them. So I'd have friends who would see me dress up, who like, oh, yep, there's Andrew. That we knew he would turn out that way. Or other 501st friends, or like I'd meet other friends through Facebook or Instagram or Twitter because of our common interests. So I think that there's been that sort of normalization there. And part of that has also come to, like, Game of Thrones, which was these big doorstop cat killer books that were of interest really to a very large segment of the fantasy fan community, but like not really a mainstream thing. That's like commonplace now. Like, if you say winter is coming, everybody knows what you mean. If you say Avengers Assemble, like, everybody knows what you mean, even if they're not like a hardcore comic fan because they've seen the Marvel movies. May the Force be with you. Almost everybody in the world has seen Star Wars, except for my mother, which is kind of ironic because I do this I've been doing this for like 20 years now. Like, the way that pop culture has shifted, it's science fiction and fantasy stuff is cool now. Like, this is what is in. It's what dominates the box office. So that is also a big segment of why I think cosplay has gotten much more popular. It's because it's just, people are interested in it now, like, just more broadly than ever before. And when you have that sort of that confluence of, like, popular movies, social media, the ease of access to making stuff, you now have all the ingredients for someone who might not have been a hardcore science fiction fantasy fan, or costumer, who had gone to conventions and like been involved in costuming communities for a long time. Like, it's just suddenly very easy for you to make a Batman costume, or to make take your pick. And those costumes might not be the greatest you've ever seen to start with, but once you make one and you learn from it and you start to make more, you start to get better at it. And I think that there's an entire community of people who are very supportive, and it's a great way to meet people of similar interests, and it's just becoming more of a thing.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the inclusivity of cosplay, because it just seems like a very inclusive hobby. When we go to Fan Expo and we see the runway, everyone's cheering, and you've got people that didn't know each other before the weekend, but now they're taking pictures together, and it just seems to be open to every type of person of all ages, and it's so inclusive. It's kind of beautiful. Can you tell us about what's going on with cosplay and being so inclusive to everyone?
Yeah, beautiful is a really good way to describe it. Ultimately, I think it's community. You're meeting folks of like mind. You have like-minded interests, and that is a very, very powerful thing, I think, because it can help. Your love of a story, I think, is something that helps transcend borders. It transcends politics. It transcends family or social networks. So I think that there's a really important element to it that makes it useful as a societal thing. It's glue that holds us together. I think it is a very inclusive community, and I'm always really relieved to see that, because there are elements of there are certainly people out there who will be like, well, that's not accurate, or your character is the wrong color. You can't have a black Batman or whatever. And by and large, people sort of reject those arguments because it's all made up. You can do whatever you want with cosplay. If you want to make a rainbow colored stormtrooper, you can do that. And it's not like when we are dressing up, we are going before cameras for a movie. We're doing this for our own pleasure, so we can do whatever we want with the characters. I think it's inclusive because I think everybody, when you're a fan, you just want to have more fans around you. And it's not really it's not a competition, or it's not always a competition. You were trying, you see someone dressed up as a character that you recognize, and you appreciate the effort that they put into it, that they've gone that step to dress up as that character. There's other elements of it too. I think I spoke with a couple of cosplayers who are trans and non-binary who they found it to be a fairly welcoming community, because you can sort of be yourself, and yourself can be changeable. You can dress up as a whatever gendered character you want, and sort of just try to be more like yourself in that, if that makes sense. Or you can dress up as a suit of armor and sort of have that part of your identity be erased. And there's a good friend of mine, Thorne, who dresses up as a Mandalorian, who they really appreciated that element, that that folks aren't really going to make those assumptions that they can find so stressful when they put the helmet on. So I think that there's that element of it too, is that you can just be yourself, and I think people just see and appreciate that. Now that to be said, or to be fair, there are groups that are very they're very strict on their appearance. Like the 501st is one such group. We have some fairly strict standards for how we have to look in order to join the group. You have to your armor has to meet those standards to be accepted in. And I think that's just sort of a level of preference for the group, just to make sure that there's a uniform look, rather than the way I've best heard it is it's not to sort of keep people out. It's just to just sort of have a standard that that everybody sort of looks, or it will either push people to improve, or to sort of it's the best word. I'm trying to remember how it was described to me, but
it kind of sets a baseline,
it's just sort of,
right?
Yeah, a baseline is a good word for it. I've seen, and as in the 501st, we don't discriminate against, you can be a guy, or sorry, you can be a girl and wear stormtrooper armor. You could be 4.5 feet tall and be a stormtrooper. You have to cut it down a little bit and make it look sort of proportional. You can be, a lot heavier and wear one, or you can be really, really thin, tall and thin. It all comes down to like just how the armor fits and how proportional and stuff it is. And, not, throughout the world of cosplay stuff, not everybody quite gets the right appearance or the right proportions or something. But, again, it's like, it's not about trying to be, it's not always about trying to match the canon experience, the canon, look and feel of a character. It's sort of an expression of your fandom. And I think that it's really hard to sort of, unless you're a really awful person, I guess, it's really sort of hard, hard to harsh that. And it's, to go out of your way to be really mean about it. So I think that there's a lot of incentive within the community to sort of, to be supportive and to really be try to uplift your fellow makers. And that's one of the things I really love about it. It's just this idea that, we're all trying to do our best, and, we recognize that.
And I think it's fascinating that, the cultural basis here is generosity, right? But that's been true of religion and any other, sort of community that you might build around that, like, Christians will come together and I believe in Jesus and you believe in Jesus, so I'm going to be generous with you and I'm going to take care of you. And now, there are all these different communities. This one is, you're a maker, I'm a maker. We love the same thing. I'm going to be generous. We're fans of the same thing. We're going to come together in the spirit of helping each other out, right? And I really have to ask you this one question, because I only recently experienced my first cosplay event at Fan Expo, but I've been going to raves and festivals for, since the 90s, and it's the same culture there. And it's not just that it's a culture of generosity because we like to dance, in the woods in the middle of the night to psytrance. That's true too, but there's a huge costume element to the whole rave scene and always has been, right? And that seems to be part of, this culture that's leaked out into cosplay. But what I find fascinating is cosplay seems to be made of, it's very generous and inclusive, yes. But as in my experience, looking around, these are all introverts. These are the nerds. These are the people that were generally quiet because they've sort of self-selected for being the kind of person that's like into some obscure thing, and they'll make this costume all year long, and then they all come out and display it. But at the raves, it's like, the exhibitionists are wearing the costumes and the extroverts and the, so there seems to be like common cultural everything from costume to generosity to inclusivity to all of that, and yet there's this diversity of like who's there. Would you agree with that? Is it sort of an introvert crowd? Like, I love that because it's nerds.
Yeah. I think it's hard to draw a too much generalization there, because there are some folks who are like they were the theater kids who are really out there and really outgoing, and really want to perform.
Right.
If you go onto Instagram and you see some folks who are, who have found their niche as a cosplay like influencer, like, some of them can be the most outgoing folks in the world. But then again, your environment also depends on your environment. You might feel, more introverted in a workplace setting or a school setting, but like when you are surrounded by friends at a convention, that whole social dynamic flips for you. Mm-hmm. The one I don't know anything about raves or the rave culture, but one of the things that I did find interesting is I went to a World War II reenactment last summer in Reading, Pennsylvania, and the folks who were dressing up in World War II gear, they were exactly the same as my 501st friends. Like, they were interested in accuracy. They were continually upgrading their kits. It's like, I found this like original patch, or I got the original, these original parts that had been real army surplus. They weren't like, I didn't have to make them myself or fabricate them myself. They had the same level of enthusiasm for what they were trying to do. So like, if you just basically swap uniforms, they're some of the same folks. And actually some people who, I've got a good friend of mine, Dan Selleck, who's a reenactor and a 501st and Rebel Legion member. So I think that there are a lot of common points from culture to culture. It's just like, how that's expressed based on your own personal interests. And that sort of takes me back to like my point about like, reenacting and living history is not really strictly cosplay, but it's got some of the same ingredients, and they sort of rhyme with one another. So it doesn't surprise me that you would find, something like rave culture, which involves a lot of sort of public performance, or at least performance with people around you. You might have folks who are a little bit more extroverted, as opposed to somebody who might be more inclined to hole up at a workshop and build a costume for 10 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, it might just be just the environment, or it might be just what interests them. And again, I think some of that's changing just because, Marvel and Star Wars and things, those are not really, of interest to the lonely nerds at high school anymore. Like I was, like, it's more of a much more mainstream thing. So, but there's room for everybody.
And for our listeners who want to find out more about the book and you, Andrew, where can they find you? You're on Twitter. Where else?
So I'm on Twitter at Andrew Liptak. My last name is Liptak. I write a newsletter called Transfer Orbit, which it's transfer-orbit.ghost.io. If you go onto Twitter or Google my name, you'll find it in one of my linked in my bio or wherever. I'm on Instagram at LiptakAA, so you can find me there. And as far as the book goes, you can find it at any. I think you can find it in the UK. I'm sure you can find it in Canada. Like, just look at any bookstore website. If you want to find the official page, if you go to simonandschuster.com and search for it, you'll find it there, and that will tell you where all the different retailers where you can find it. It's available trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook. As of writing it right now, I don't think they've begun. We've got a really fantastic narrator. I don't think she's begun narrating it just yet. She's waiting on me to provide a couple of pronunciations, which I need to do. And it'll be available June 28th, which I'm very excited and nervous about. We'll see. Hopefully, I'm hoping that people will like it. It's been sitting in my head for a whole bunch of years, and we'll see if it makes sense to anybody else.
Well, I've been enjoying it, and I look forward to seeing all the photos, because that's the fun stuff, right?
Yeah.
Just the eye candy is really what cosplay is about.
Yeah, it's a very visual hobby, and I'm hoping that it will be a good. I'm hoping that it'll be something that people can flip through and enjoy, or read, straight through cover to cover, or just read a chapter or two just to get a better understanding of something. But I really hope people enjoy it. But yeah, until it comes out, I'll be sort of sitting in this state of nervousness, wondering if folks will enjoy it. So far, people seem to have, but
Well, thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. This has been great.
Thanks, Andrew.
It's been a lot of fun.
Nice to meet you.
I know. Thank you.
Wait, before you go, we have to show you our main cosplay experience.
Oh, Will Shatner.
Yeah.
When was that taken?
Just this year at Fan Expo, the one we went to. Yeah, he looks like a shriveled raisin. Yeah. We had a great time.
It looks like a wax mannequin. I don't care what anyone says. William Shatner looks amazing. Okay, so if you listen to this episode to the end, you should probably just go and rate us. Let us know what you think of the show. We want to hear from you. We've got some great episodes coming out over the summer. Charles Stross is coming on the show, another trivia episode special, and then we're going to do a 1-year anniversary special. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.